Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I am joined today by Michael Mechanic. He is senior editor at Mother Jones magazine and the author of the book Jackpot: How the Super Rich Really Live and How Their Wealth Harms Us All. Michael Mechanic, thank you for joining us today on Current Affairs.
Thanks for having me. You make it sound so dramatic.
Well, this is what I try to do. I try to build everything up. We get a bit of drama in it, get a bit of excitement.
I mean, it is dramatic, right?
It is dramatic. It is dramatic. You're writing about the most important issues in the world. You're writing about the class struggle, Michael. So your book takes us inside a world that many of us, most of us, will never get to see the inside of. That is to say, the world of the super or uber wealthy. So tell us first, how did you pry open the door? What did you do to try and get an inside look at the world that is often discussed but rarely seen, this world of the super wealthy?
I pried into it painstakingly.
Yeah.
Not being from that world, one cannot just cold call billionaires and say, hey, talk to me about your money. I mean, nobody likes to talk about their personal finances. Right. It's sort of taboo in our society. So it requires a lot of legwork and a lot of sort of working from the outside, talking to people, who are in the circles of very wealthy people. And in fact, there's a lot of stuff you just have to glean from those interactions because there are some people, of course, who won't let you get anywhere near. And I write about in the book about sort of the frequency of rejection. You kind of have to go into it knowing you got a list of targets, so to speak. I had a whole big Google Doc full of targets. And like this person, and like I said, you can't cold call them. So you have to find somebody who knows them and then get an introduction. And even then, you'll often have to go through a PR team or, different layers. They call it the entourage, right? The entourage that very wealthy people have around them, whether it be financial or public relations or, through a company or whatever. And it's very hard to penetrate. And you can penetrate it when you want to talk about their business acumen or, how great their philanthropy is, right? But when you want to ask hard questions that get very personal about their wealth and sort of their interactions with the world, it's rare that you can find people willing to reveal their feelings. They feel very vulnerable.
Well, yes. So, yeah, when people hear, hey, would you be willing to talk to this journalist from left-leaning, muckraking Mother Jones magazine for his book on how the super wealthy's wealth harms us all? I imagine a lot of people shut down. But yes, you indicate there's this uneasiness or anxiety. You talk to people in the book who feel kind of guilty about their wealth sometimes. So tell us a bit about that, about the unease that comes with the possession of vast wealth.
Well, there are a lot of anxieties related to wealth because we think about the way the world perceives us. And as you move up and become more of a public figure in a way, you're more visible to people when you have a lot of wealth. And there's this perception that, this person isn't authentic and they're not down to earth and they don't experience the world the way I do, the way we do. And actually, there's a lot of truth to that, right? Unless you somehow can hide your wealth and live in your normal mixed wealth, middle class community, most very wealthy people want to enjoy their wealth in some regard. And often they want more space. They want, it's sort of the usual. It's like the reason people flee cities for the suburbs, right? They want more space. They want better schools, whatever. This whole thing is like the white flight thing. But there's a wealth flight as well. And they're partially the same, right? Because most very wealthy people are white. But there's a fleeing of mixed wealth areas for sort of wealth havens. So you get this areas like where people are geographically separate from the rabble. And on the other hand, you have very concentrated areas of poverty, and the mixed wealth areas shrink. And so you have this sort of great distance between the rich and the poor. And you see the same thing with CEOs and workers. Over the decades, the distance between them financially has gotten so extraordinary that you would never find them living in the same neighborhood ever,
Yeah, that's interesting because it helps to explain something that seems at first to be a little bit of a paradox, which is that a number of the super wealthy seem to not desire fame in that they want to kind of lay low. I think this Harlan Crow guy who was the friend of Clarence Thomas was horrified to be dragged into the public eye because everyone recognizes that the pitchforks might come for them, if only on Twitter, if they become a public figure, because you can be resented and despised. But at the same time, I say paradox because you also write about conspicuous consumption and the way in which status is expressed through the possession of things that are displayed to others. You quote Karl Marx talking about when the palace arises next to the little house turns into a hut, this idea that one's status is in part determined by how one looks standing next to other people, but at the same time, you don't want to be too public or else you might attract undue attention. So can you talk about that mixture of the desire to be seen and not seen?
We all compare ourselves to our peers, the people in our professions, the people close to us, people at our churches, whatever, the people in our circles. There was another quote there that says the beggar doesn't envy the billionaire. They envy the beggar with the better, panhandling area, whatever. So what happens is even when people do segregate themselves by wealth, there's still this competition. It's the fancy Joneses, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And there's been studies about this. If you're living in a wealthy area and you're in the top 10% of the house distribution, essentially the high-end houses within an area, as the house sizes get bigger, you become less satisfied with your lot. So there really is a lot of social comparison when you move into sort of what I call the bubble, right? Mm-hmm. You go to the party and this guy's talking about his private equity deal and this guy's talking about his private jet and this guy about his new Bugatti and hey, this house in Aspen, right? People they socialize and they drop these, it's not always that blatant, but there's the way we talk to each other. It's like, oh, where are your kids going to school? Mine are going to Yale and Harvard and, as opposed to University of Florida. So these things sort of come out in social situations. And the more you're kind of segregated into a bubble of wealth, it normalizes these things that are actually very weird. And, the idea that you own a private jet, I mean, it's kind of crazy, right? And it's terrible for the planet, by the way.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the weirdness of this world. I'm sure you discovered in the course of your research things within this world that you didn't realize existed, or that that makes sense that people buy them when they have a lot of money. For me, with the one reading your book, you talk about concierge doctors and you talk about how there are doctors. There are doctors where you don't sign in and you don't wait. And I was like, what?
And you don't see any other patients. You walk in, you get your cucumber water, and they say, "Hi, Jim," and how's your kids? So how's Judy and how's Patricia and whatever. They know you and they know what you do, and they ask you about your business, and they time it so you actually never see another patient because who wants to mix with other people?
Yeah. So were there things that you found where you're like, "Wow, I had not heard of that."
Well, a lot. In fact, I mean, it's not just stuff, but services. And you hear more about these every day. I mean, I was just reading Timothy Noah in the New Republic. Timothy Noah has done a lot of work on inequality. And he was just reporting on something called a Tophat pension, which is sort of a way of giving incredibly large retirement savings to CEOs. And this is money that comes directly out of the company's pool that, could be lifting the lower workers' salaries or giving them better retirement benefits. But it's just sort of about the deterioration of a company pension. And now it's like 401ks, right? So you got to, maybe if you're lucky, they'll give some kind of match, but most companies don't, right? Mm-hmm. In the meantime, for their executives, they have this like high tier retirement savings. Retirement savings is something I didn't talk about in the book, but I've since done a lot of research on. And it's very, very heavily federally subsidized. And it's very skewed toward the wealthiest. I mean, it's quite incredible how much it costs. We're talking about over 5 years, almost $2 trillion in tax breaks. I mean, that's enough to fund like the Biden's Build Back Better package that got rejected, right? We think about the welfare state, we think about poor people, but it's actually wealthy people who are getting most of the benefits flowing from the federal government.
Yeah, I did want to ask you what you think some of the more unfair or unjustifiable legal structures or pieces of policy that really maintain extreme inequality.
Well, okay, so one thing you see is, you can debate the role of estate taxes. Well, they were at first enacted to pay for wars back in the day, and then they would be repealed. But ultimately, when you think about sort of the goal of the founders of America, we were not to be an aristocracy. We were trying to escape this whole, feudal state where the rich people controlled everything. This supposed to be, land, a republic controlled by the people to some degree. Obviously, it's a mixed bag the way they set it up. I mean, there was a huge, I write about this debate between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson was arguing that the aristocracy is going to go away in the new republic because of the availability of land. And then, we're getting rid of all those hereditary laws in England that gave the property to the firstborn son and all these types of things. He said, everybody, this can be, this is going to be this beautiful equal opportunity place. But over the years, the way our tax code has been sculpted, it allows money to accumulate in families and continue to accumulate and accumulate. And there are all these legalized trust structures that have come about. And these are things you would never hear about unless either you are really interested in digging in and read about it, or you have the money such that you would actually consider them. If you look at the current lifetime exemption from gift or estate taxes, meaning the amount of money you can give your kids tomorrow without paying any taxes on it, it's about 26 million today. $26 million. Like a couple can give their kids that much money without paying a dime. Then beyond that, there are a million little ways to move money around, put it in different types of trust structures to essentially over the generations create dynasties. And we've had a growing number of these in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And the dynastic wealth was never an American ideal, but it's become an American reality. And then these dynasties have incredible political power, and they're trying to repeal the estate tax. They are funding, anti-minimum wage. I mean, all this stuff. So, when I talk about how their wealth harms us all, it's like, well, dynastic wealth is used to generate more wealth. It's funny because there's people always bring up Warren Buffett. He's a good guy. He's humble. He's modest. Well, Warren Buffett, not only does he partake in all of these advantages, even though he says, tax me more, right?
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's understandable. He said, these guys say, hey, I think the rules are unfair, but I'm going to play by the rules. That's that we have, because why should I not?
Yeah.
Right? I'm not just going to hand money to the government that it doesn't, that I don't have to, right? But you should change the rules. But then behind the scenes, these very wealthy folks hire all these money managers, they hire Wall Street banks and so forth. Those guys are doing the lobbying behind the scenes to keep all the perks. So It's really hard to go out there and be the good rich guy and say, tax me more, when you know that the people who are managing your wealth are lobbying
making sure you won't have to be taxed more.
I'm not saying they don't have good intent. I mean, they might really believe that. But the fact is, unless you are just sort of have an independent wealth manager doing everything to your liking and maybe not taking advantage of every last possible way to get around taxes. One thing I talk about is how the wealth is overwhelming. It's like trying to manage it yourself. Forget it, right? You have other things you want to do in life than sit around and deal with the mind-numbing arcana of trusts and estate law. So you hire people, and the default in the industry is to maximize wealth and minimize taxes.
Yeah, you've just touched there on the ways in which the super rich actually affect policy. You have this quite striking question that you ask in the book, which is you ask the reader whether you can get your congressman or senator on the phone, whether you interacted with them or can interact with them personally. And a reader might think, well, of course not. But you point out that the answer to that question is entirely dependent on how much wealth you have, because it is the case that there are plenty of people who can talk to their elected representatives.
Right. And who maybe help them become elected representatives. People, of the Harlan Crow ilk have enough money that they could actually have a big impact on who gets elected. With Harlan Crow and Clarence Thomas, they say, well, Crow hasn't had any cases before the court. But the thing is, Harlan Crow is a huge Republican donor. He is in the business of political influence, essentially. And Clarence Thomas has not recused himself from any of these cases that would allow Harlan Crow, for instance, to make massive political donations and keep them anonymous, like Citizens United and various other, things that open the floodgates to money coming in from the rich and corporations. I talked to a guy recently, a psychologist at Berkeley, who wanted to write a book and he wanted to talk to me about it. He was making the point that the founders came up with all these checks and balances just so that one part of the government didn't get too out of control. There was always a way to rein them in. He said, but what they didn't take into account is the accumulation of wealth and how that was going to affect the whole government system. So essentially there's this fifth tier, right? You've got your branches, then you've got journalism trying to keep things in check. And then you have this gigantic pile of money over here that's going to have its way. And there's nothing to keep a check on that.
Yeah, the Crow thing's been quite fascinating as a kind of peek inside power really operates and who has it. I mean, all of the arguments that are made in Thomas's defense are, well, he didn't have any cases, he didn't change any votes. But gosh, I wish I could just call up a Supreme Court justice and tell them what I think about things. I think
Nathan, you just have to get a yacht.
I just have to get a nice plane and offer to take them someplace.
Well, they also, Clarence Thomas, I think that painting might have been at Bohemian Grove. I know, the Supreme Court justice will go to Bohemian Grove, which is this haven of the rich and powerful here in California. It's an exclusive club, both in San Francisco, and then they have this place out in the Redwoods, which is very hard to get into. It's kind of like Burning Man for the extraordinarily rich, where people have their encampments, sort of. And I think even probably within Bohemian Grove, you have to know the right people to get invited to the right parties with it, But there's a lot of mixing. That's another thing of the bubble. I talked about the wealth bubble also crosses over to influence. So here's the thing. It's like when I talked about sort of geographical segregation of rich and poor, one thing that the concentration does is it propagates both advantage and disadvantage. So if you are living in a community of very wealthy people, and those are the people you interact with socially, you're just going to have a lot more opportunities for sort of cross-pollination. People, if you have a business venture, you'll find people to partner with and to put money into your business venture. If you need connections so you can raise money to start a company, hey, this guy who's part of this venture fund, these sorts of connections. When you have mixing of wealth, it actually has been shown to provide a lot more opportunity for people for social mobility. And you don't get that when you have the segregation.
Tell us a little bit more about what you discovered about how money works in politics. You talked to a congressman that in the book about how lobbying actually works. What did you discover about how the sausage is actually made? And you've talked about how there's all these interests in keeping the tax code favorable and keeping policy structured in a way that perpetuates dynasties. But, what is it that money does in order to ensure the correct political outcomes?
Both ensures that people can get reelected. Members of Congress, they serve very short terms, and they're always fundraising all the time. There's no end to it. The maximum that you can give to a given person, I think it's for couples, I think like $5,800 now. That's the maximum that they can technically ask for. Then you can give unlimited money to a political party. And so there's this temptation for members of Congress to also raise money on behalf of their party because that gives them power within the party. And I talked to Russ Feingold, first of all, who, was part of the McCain-Feingold finance reform. Now, he's no longer in office, but he had a lot to say. He's very frustrated to see his signature achievement be torn down. He says it's worse than ever, worse than it ever was now, with all the Supreme Court bit by bit chipped away at everything he had achieved as far as campaign finance reform. So he was pissed off. So I talked to Tom Malinowski, who was a New Jersey congressman. He actually just recently lost his seat because they redistricted, and he got a raw deal. So he used to be a lobbyist for Human Rights Watch. And so he says, I don't have any problem with lobbyists. I used to be one. Not all lobbyists are, we have a right to, go in there and try to affect policy. It could be for good, it could be for ill. And he said, so I let lobbyists come to my office and talk to me. Sure, no problem. I mean, there is that access thing. Once you're in the door, that's when these things start happening. But the problem is when you mix lobbying with fundraising, there's almost never directly a quid pro quo. But it's also like an understanding, it's like, you hear my point of view, we're going to give you this money, and keep it in mind when you're voting. It's very rare you can catch somebody in the act saying, I'm going to give you this money for this vote. It just doesn't happen anymore, at least that we know of. But yeah, right. So that's basically.
Right. But everyone knows that if they started to act differently, if they started to sound more like Bernie Sanders, the checks can stop coming very fast.
I think about, Manchin and cinema. I mean, Kristen Sinema in particular, she kind of got in bed with these private equity people. And, she would not vote to get rid of carried interest, which is an absurd thing. Carried interest, essentially, first of all, private equity people are paid enormously well as it is. They raise hundreds of millions of dollars from institutional investors. They take a big annual fee, and they make these sort of years-long investments in whatever it happens to be that they specialize in. And the way it works is like called 80-20. So they promise that if the thing succeeds, the investors get at least, say, a base return of 8% or whatever. And then anything above and beyond that is split 80% the investors get, 20% the fund managers get. So that's like, in addition to the fees that they charge, they're getting like a huge, huge payback when things go well, which they often do in these cases. Private equity is very lucrative. And sometimes they do it, in real estate, they'll pull out about all this money from loans, they'll put the thing in debt, take out all the money up front, pay everybody off, and then, it's nothing but upside for them. So the question is, how do you tax that money? Well, they've managed to convince the government to tax it as capital gains at 20%, as opposed to wages at 37%. So that's like a ridiculous tax break. In fact, I mean, one thing I just don't understand, I've never heard a good rationale for it, is why you tax investment gains at the same rate. Why don't you tax investment gains at the same rate as wages? So if I'm a rich guy and I have $50 million free cash and I put it in the stock market, and the stock market goes up and I sell that stock, I've done nothing except had a bunch of money. And my tax rate, that money is much lower than as if I had worked for that money. I think that rubs a lot of people the wrong way. I ask people, so what's your rationale for that? And they say, well, you got to incentivize people to invest and whatever. I'm like, come on, man. Like, are you going to put the money under your mattress? Well, you have to put it somewhere. Are you going to put it in the bank at like 2% interest? No, they don't want to sit and watch their money incrementally grow. They want to get another big payback, right?
Right.
They having hit the jackpot once, they want to hit it again.
That's a very clear example. I mean, cinema of the direct policy consequence of an interest group that wants to preserve a policy that makes absolutely no sense, except on the justification that this particular group would like to stay very wealthy.
Yeah, they really schmoozed with her. And I mean, maybe they showered love and affection. I don't know. I mean, everybody wants to be recognized and loved. And it's the same with rich people and the same with politicians.
Yeah.
And I think a little love goes a long way. This is another, in writing about the anxieties of the super rich, there's actually a lot of loneliness because there's so much social isolation from being wealthy. People do it deliberately, because they live in some big house that's far from the other houses, and they limit their social pool because they don't trust people as much. I mean, there's this lack of trust. It's like, is somebody who comes to me in friendship coming because they like me, or do they see that I'm wealthy and want a piece?
Yeah, you can't trust anyone anymore because everyone wants your money.
It's unfortunate. I mean, it's a really unfortunate position to be in. I mean, especially if you're a billionaire, right? Everybody who comes at you wants something. Everybody,
Yeah.
even just to be in their circles, right? I talked to a guy who made his first smaller jackpot as working at Microsoft. He was like an early employee, and he later became the president of a dot-com era, company, and that went crazy on the stock market, and he made another big fortune. But he talked about the friends of Bill, the people who had access to Gates' inner circle, and there was like a social cachet to being friends of Bill. Just so just to be in the sort of inner circle of these super wealthy, that has a value of its own, even just for people's egos, right? There's a guy I talk about in the book who is named Richard Watts. He actually literally calls himself a consigliere for these very wealthy families. He's a lawyer. No matter what you need done, he'll get it done. I mean, it's crazy stuff. It's like Crazy Rich Asians. I talk about that in the book. It's like he has clients, somebody, their kids want to get married. Their rich daughter wants to marry a, middle-class guy. And they're like, who is this guy? Check him out. Go check him out. So he'll hire this private detective to go check out everything about this guy's past. Does he have a baby mama somewhere? Is he lying about anything? Does he have any hidden criminal record? Just there's not much trust there, especially with the parents, right? Because, your children are out there in the world. And a lot of times, children in wealthy families feel just sort of under this umbrella of they're smothered, right? They're too close to the mothership. The money binds them tightly to it. You know what I mean? It's like a tractor beam. You get these very wealthy families, and there's usually it's a patriarch. So you got the patriarch, and for generations, the family stays close because they're all trying to stay close to that money. I mean, and that's great for the patriarch because he can have the family reunions, and everybody comes and they toast him, but it can be stifling for young people who can't fully launch because there's a trust. They don't want to be written out of the trust, right? Yeah. With Succession, if you watch Succession, it's kind of like they always talk about the trust.
Yeah.
What's the deal with the trust,
Yeah, I wanted to ask you more about the sociological piece of your book, understanding what it is like for these people and what these people are like. I assume that one of the questions you have probably had to answer before about this book is that people want to know from someone who knows whether money can buy happiness. My takeaway from your book is not really, but it can help with a lot of things.
Yeah, well, first of all, to be poor is to be miserable. I mean, to be really poor is to be miserable. It's horrible, right? And so the studies that are done on money and happiness, I just actually wrote about this for The Atlantic, on how, there's we put too much stake in these studies because actually the effect is pretty small. But for people at very low incomes, there's a direct linear relationship between logarithm of the income and self-reported measures of happiness. And that makes sense because it's really not happiness you're measuring. It's the lifting of misery at the lower levels, right? Because, you make $30,000 a year, you can barely pay your rent. Housing just sucking up, most of your income. You have to script and save, and you're running up credit card bills and whatever. It's, it's an existence that is not fun, right? As you go higher up, researchers have found sort of a leveling off of that effect at fairly low amounts until fairly recently a study came out that claimed it keeps going up, well above $200,000. But then there's caveats in that paper that, when the media reports on these things, they say, look, money does buy happiness. But when you look at you look at the fine print, it's like, oh, well, it's actually a really small effect. And there's all kinds of other effects. Like if you have children or if you're a caregiver, your happiness goes down. And you think, oh, but no, children bring you joy. It's like, well, yeah, they bring you joy, but they also bring you misery because, you're only as happy as your least happy child at any given time.
Yeah.
I just want to talk about children and wealth. It's like children who know they're going to inherit a lot of wealth, especially through the family trust, right? So it's never really yours. It's just sort of this mass of wealth floating around that you have to stay connected to. I think Elizabeth, not her real name, but someone I talked to in the book, and she's talking about her inheritor friends, including one who's one of the Rothschild heirs and so forth. She said there's a vagueness about these people, sort of meandering through life. It's like there's a low stakes to things.
Yeah.
You take a job, oh, you don't like it, it's quit, because you don't need to be there. Money is such a motivating factor in the way we define ourselves. It's not so much like, oh, I need money to think well of myself. It's more like we measure success by money, which is a bad thing to do, by the way.
Yeah.
But if money is not a motivating factor, then what is your motivating factor? And
Yeah.
and society also perceives money as a measure of success. So if you're not, let's say I don't need money, but I am doing a career that is very low paid, well, I'm still not getting the respect, right?
Yeah.
So, it's really complicated, our relationship with money.
Yeah.
And it can cause, a lot of just strange pathologies.
Strange pathology. Yeah, that very much comes through in the book. It's just funny what you say about money as a motivator, because I write a lot. Like, I publish a lot, and people often say, like, oh, how do you write so much? And I go, well, if I don't write, I don't eat. Like, I write more because I have to be paid. Like, if I don't churn out constant writing for the magazine, subscriptions don't come in, the magazine dies. It's a fantastic motivator. It's made me a really good writer, but, so that...
Write more, eat more. You get dessert.
But if you're guaranteed to eat no matter what, why should you write?
Right. And also sort of like, why should you do anything in particular? Actually, honestly, my parents, my dad was a college professor. My mom was a very early doctor. She was like one of very few women in her graduating class in medical school. And she'd go into a doctor's office to care for a patient. They'd say, when's the doctor going to come in? That kind of thing. And she was paid much less than the male doctors and so forth. Anyway, it was a comfortable, probably upper middle class childhood for me. And I went to public university, which didn't cost very much but I didn't have to pay for college. So even for me, there was a vagueness, right? But it's not the vagueness of like the person who stands to inherit millions of dollars.
Yeah.
And knows it, and then just sort of dabbles into, you look at like people go into philosophy because they can. We're seeing everybody wants to go into STEM because that's where like practical careers and money are. Whereas the humanities are kind of shrinking because it's seen as sort of the vanity things, right? When I was going to school, it was like you could do the humanities and then go into wherever, right? You just had a good broad education, but now you got to go and make the money. Mm-hmm. It's really that way in computer science. I was talking to Clive Thompson, who wrote a book called Coders. He was talking to a computer science professor, and he said, in the early days, the people who came into this field were just the geeks, the nerds. They just loved the code and whatever. It's like now the kids come in to this field because they want the money. What used to be the big mills to like shuttle people towards Wall Street became shuttling to Silicon Valley.
Probably not good for ingenuity, actually, since the desire...
ingenuity, but also just sort of like, instead, the business people, Wall Street, you go because like there's only one reason to go to Wall Street, right? Is that's make a ton of money. That's the only reason. It's a soulless place. But Silicon Valley, you can go and still make a lot of money and convince yourself that you're doing, making the world a better place, is the cliche, right?
Well, I was thinking as I was reading your book, like which of our stereotypes about the rich you had kind of confirmed and which you kind of challenge in the book. I think there's a bit of both, right? I think sometimes when I'm reading your book, I go, yeah, that's, the kind of more money, more problems thing, it becomes evident. And the idea that it's probably not good for a lot of people to have a lot of money, concentrated wealth, not good for them or for anybody else.
Well, it's funny because if wealth just drops into your lap, the proverbial jackpot moment, which I talk about. In fact, part of the book was the idea that we have this fantasy in our society. We love the strike it rich thing. In fact, when I was a kid, I never cared that much about money, but I did love the idea of treasure, finding treasure. And I used to go in the park behind my house, and the old men with the metal detectors would walk around looking for stuff. I would follow them around. I was, it's like how you would go up to a fisherman and say, what did you catch? Right? Yeah. It's the same kind of thing. What do you find? What do you find? Because the idea of like finding some like trove of gold doubloons or whatever, I loved that idea. And I read Richie Rich. The Richie Rich was whatever, which I went back and looked at it recently. It's a weird comic. Anyway, that's another story. I didn't like the superheroes. I liked Richie Rich. But at the same time, I was not, I wasn't obsessed with money or anything until I wrote the book. Sorry, I'm going off track here. What was I talking
But
about?
this idea, well, you were talking about the idea of the jackpot, but when we actually get it,
Yeah, when we actually get it, it's sort of like, okay, now what? Right?
Hmm.
I mean, because the fantasy is you're going to be Thurston Howell the third, and you're going to live in luxury and sit by the pool. Actually, I talked to the same woman in my book, Elizabeth. She said, I know these guys made a friggin' fortune in Silicon Valley, and then they retire, and they retire at 45, right? And they are spending their time golfing with 70-year-olds. And after a while, there's like, this is just so boring.
it's boring.
Like, what the hell am I doing? Like, well, another guy I talked to in the book was, he's a lawyer. His wife's father died, and then both of his parents died, all in a very short period. And all of a sudden, they had like this ridiculous inheritance that they hadn't expected. And he's like, I don't really like my job. I'm just going to not work anymore. And he could. And so he started joining, the boards of progressive nonprofit organizations and so forth like this. But, he said it was really uncomfortable because so much of us we define ourselves by our work and what we do. And all of a sudden I had all this money. I'd wake up in the morning not knowing what I had to do today. And then you'd be places. And of course, the question is, what do you do? And you're kind of hard to answer that question without telling them, well, actually, you don't need any money because you inherited all this money. So, I mean, it's really different depending on how it comes. Inherited jackpot is a different thing than a jackpot that you scraped away for years and years and years. You worked to build a company over 30 years and then sold it. And all of a sudden you got $500 million and you have nothing to do, but you are incredibly rich. What then, right?
Yeah.
I talk about in the book, I went to this charity poker tournament hosted by Tiger Woods in Vegas. And, Russell Westbrook was there and all these company founders were there and they're playing, $10,000 buy-in. It was all for Tiger's foundation. And I meet this guy who is in his 30s. He was probably 33 or something. He was a main interest in this cannabis company. He just sold it for $1 billion. A super nice guy. He had this like vape pen, but it was like bespoke. It was like bejeweled, and someone told me it would cost him like $100,000. He had it specially made. And, his fiance was there. She was super nice. She was all like Gucci'd out. And I also heard he had just come back from London where he had bought a hotel and didn't even tell his wife about it. And she's like, what? She's like, you what? It's about a hotel.
Yeah, like you were buying a pastry.
Exactly. A croissant, you want the croissant or the hotel? I mean, but that's the crazy thing. Like at these levels, okay, so a boat, I have a couple of friends who have sailboats. They're like a 25 or 30-foot boat, whatever. And so we went out on the San Francisco Bay last weekend, and it was really rough. It was actually kind of miserable, but at first it was really cool. It's great to have a friend with a boat, but I don't want to own one.
Right.
Because it's like a huge hassle, right? And if you own it and you don't go out all the time, you feel like it's just this albatross, right?
Yeah.
Then you got these guys that are buying yachts the size of, bigger than a football field. I mean, literally like 400 meters or whatever. Jeff Bezos's yacht apparently has another yacht just to service it. I mean, just to bring it stuff. And it's like the side yacht,
Yeah. Yeah.
And how often do you think he's on that yacht? I mean, a couple weeks a year. I also wonder how much of it could be written off as a business expense because, like, it's used for entertaining clients and business partners and stuff. I mean, we're probably all subsidizing that lifestyle.
Oh God!
Not to mention when we order stuff on Amazon.
Yeah. When Bezos went to space, he said, "Oh, thank you to our customers and to our employees because you made this." Yes.
Yeah, they literally made that, but like until recently, they weren't even paid minimum wage. Well, they weren't paid $15 an hour until just a couple of years ago.
Possible with the money I didn't pay you.
Here's what I don't understand, right? So in Washington, I think I mentioned this in the book. In Washington, there was a state ballot proposal to raise taxes on the super wealthy to help fund sort of middle class initiatives. And Bezos and Steve Ballmer from Microsoft, they spent like hundreds of thousands of dollars of their own cash to shoot down this thing. I just kind of go, why? Like, what is this to you, pal?
It's
Like
pocket change.
you have more
Yeah.
money that could be spent in 20 lifetimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you're going out here and spending money to shoot down this thing that's going to tax you more. Come on.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it's so
It can make zero difference to your lifestyle. Or,
zero.
right.
I mean, you could cut their money well in half or by in a quarter, and it would still make probably zero difference. So that gets us to the wealth pledge, like the Bill Gates charity pledge, the giving pledge.
Mm-hmm.
People say, but the wealthy do such great things with their charitable initiatives. It's like, not if you look at the stats. I mean, the giving pledge is, first of all, it's like the pledge is to give away half of your wealth. And it used to be during your lifetime, but they kind of scrapped that. So they say a majority of your wealth, which is half plus a penny, right? That's a majority. And it's not binding. You sign up for this, you can get all the acclaim and then just not do it. Not only that, it was like,
they all seem to be still pretty rich. So
yeah. Oh, that's the thing. It's like one guy I talked to who written a book on philanthropy told me that the people currently on the list, except for one or two, they're all richer than when they signed the pledge.
Right. Yeah.
It's like, how are you giving away half your wealth and you're richer now than 20 years ago when
So,
I mean, very few people are giving their money away at a sizable enough clip. Now, Mackenzie Scott is a shining example of like how to do it right. She's just she's just shoveling it out as fast as she can. And she's, instead of creating some foundation in perpetuity, she is just got a bunch of smart people around to help her vet. Like, who do we give this money to make a more equitable future for the rest, right? And then figure out how much money can they handle, because you can't just dump $100 million on a small nonprofit, right? It'll destroy them just the way it would destroy a person.
Sure. So, as you point out, I'll believe the giving pledge when one of them is actually poor at the end. And you mentioned in the book, I think, this the kind of diminishing utility thing that's really important, where like if I give you a burrito, that's very nice, and if I give you a second burrito, like that's less enjoyable than the first burrito, and then your 47th burrito is just totally unnecessary. So the giving pledge is,
and I will hate you and the burritos.
If I promised you burritos number 50 to 100, right, I'll keep. Like, they don't lose. They're willing to give up wealth, but they never give up any utility, right? Because their lifestyles never, ever change.
Right. And, and for a lot of them, wealth is a strategy. I mean, philanthropy is just a strategy. And it's part of their whole mix of things like reputation burnishing, tax breaks. How can we give away the right amount of money so it will make us look good, but yet we don't really have to give anything substantial up? I mean, and what you see in Silicon Valley, the big thing is the donor advice funds. It's like a tiny foundation that it's just like a parking place for charitable money, which you put in this account sort of when it's convenient for you. When you need to take a big tax break, you put a chunk in this account. And the federal government has no requirement that you have to pay it out at any particular time. I mean, foundations right now, you only have to pay out 5% of their total assets per year, and that includes overhead. So overhead would include sending your board of directors to Ibiza for a week-long board meeting at a fancy hotel, right? That would come out of the overhead. So, I mean, you could have a foundation that is accumulating money because it's all invested anyway, right? So it's just piling on more and more money, and you can keep expanding it and buying new buildings for it. And, you can have members of your own family working there at pretty high salaries. Wealthy people get away with it are just legion. And no, some of them are totally on the up and up and like, this is a charitable foundation. We want to do good. We're going to spend it down in 50 years. Right. And that's great. But Congress really blew it when it came to setting up the rules around foundations. I mean, I talk about in the book, John D. Rockefeller first went to Congress trying to get a charter for the first like general purpose charitable foundation. And Congress was just like, forget you, dude. This is back when there was a lot more hostility towards like these super wealthy people. Teddy Roosevelt was ripping on him, and people testifying, this is just like incredibly undemocratic. And it is undemocratic. So if you, let's say your marginal top tax rate is 37% on your income, and you give away $100 million, well, that means 37% of that 100 million is covered by the US taxpayers. And if you're not spending that money on things, in the public interest, basically you're just having taxpayers subsidize whatever your priorities are. Mm-hmm. And that is another form of flexing power. It's the opposite of democratic. People always say, the government is a lousy charity, it's inefficient. It's like, that's true, but the government's not a charity. It's not its role, it's not what it's supposed to be doing. And there's no doubt things that private interests can do better and more efficiently, but they can do that without government help.
Right. I did just want to ask you, before we conclude here, I read the Wall Street Journal's Mansion section every Friday, and I'm continuously appalled by excess upon excess. I see things like there was a feature in the newspaper in the Times the other day about the increasing cost of high-end toddler birthday parties that can run $75,000 or more now, and they're getting increasingly complicated. You saw a lot of the kind of really absurd end of how wealth is deployed by people who don't even know how to spend their money. And maybe you could give us a little insight into what I always wonder, I want to ask you, what is the mindset of someone who spent $75,000 for a children's birthday party?
The mindset is that it's play money is meaningless to you, right? That $75,000 could do part of the expression of wealth of good for some poor families, right? But instead, just like, oh, we'll just throw it away here. I mean, I think there's this attitude among certain people. It's like, well, hey, I earned this and I can use it however I want. And if it's frivolous, it's frivolous. And, screw you if you're going to criticize me because I can do it. And everything has a price, right? You can get whatever you want. There was a part I'm talking about, the Centurion card, the black card, right? And about how some black person had the black card, this American Express card that's only given by invitation to very, very wealthy people, or people spend, at least $350,000 a year or something like that on their credit card. They wanted the actual horse that Kevin Costner rode in Dances with Wolves. And so they asked the concierge to find it for them. So the black card concierges go and they track down the horse. It was in Mexico, and they buy it and they deliver it to the guy. Another black card holder wanted some sand from the Dead Sea for his child to use in a school project in London. And so they sent a courier to the Dead Sea, got some actual sand and had it shipped to London. I mean, these things are just silly, right? Mm-hmm. They're silly and they're excessive, but they're also just sort of a slap in the face of people who are hurting and struggling. That's the other side of it. You can say, oh, this is harmless. It's their money. But to watch people literally burn their money, almost literally burn their money for stupid things and things that people would ridicule them for. And Kim Kardashian in the middle of the pandemic was Instagramming about, she took all these friends of hers to this island for this getaway so they could pretend things were normal. And she's bragging about this. And everybody else is locked in their houses, and out of work and whatever, and out of school, and people are really suffering. And see, that's the bubble, right? It's pretty distasteful. I would think even in the bubble, it's distasteful. She was clueless move, right?
Right. And you think about what all that wealth could do if deployed to different ends.
Yeah.
A lot of lives could be better.
They could be. But I mean, you could also say just, to start out, just tax these people more because they're clearly not spending their money for the right things, right?
I did come away reaffirmed in my conviction that they should be taxed more.
I mean, there's actually an argument for people say, well, the government sucks and they build nuclear weapons and they do all these. Yeah, the government does a lot of questionable things and is incredibly inefficient. But there's also an argument that people should be taxed more just because. Not so the government has more money, but to rein in some of the wealth inequality.
Right.
Because it's really damaging to society. And you don't know, it gets rid of the middle class. If you lose your middle class, you kind of lose a lot of the stability in a society. I mean, you look at these really unstable countries and they have extreme wealth inequality. And we're becoming that way. Look at how unstable our society has become. We're teetering on the brink of like democracy imploding.
Yeah, you tax them so that you don't have a tiny aristocracy developing that rules over everyone else. Well, people, if they want to find out more about this world from how things look on the inside of the bubble from a muckraking journalist who did a lot of legwork, as he says, to pry it open and have a look inside, they can pick up the book Jackpot, How the Super Rich Really Live and How Their Wealth Harms Us All. Michael Mechanic is a senior editor at Mother Jones Magazine. Michael Mechanic, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
And thank you. And if people want to look at my website, they go to readjackpot.com.
Readjackpot.com. Everyone should go there.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.